Thank you, everyone, for being here. We're getting into our next session right now. We'll be speaking about the fiscal situation of the United States. Let me just start by making reference to Peter G. Peterson, who was the longest-serving CED trustee for many, many years. He divided his career, his lifetime, between public service and successful engagement in the private sector. He was one of the founders of the Blackstone Group, and he was a Secretary of Commerce. In the later years of his life, he devoted much of his effort to trying to make the United States more fiscally responsible. In the June 13th, 2005 issue of Newsweek magazine, I'm sure each of you keeps a copy of it next to your bedsides. He famously asked the question, and it's one that has inspired CED for many, many years, ever since that time. And the question was, where have all the corporate statesmen gone? Now, Pete was a very, very bright guy, but with all respect to Pete, maybe he should have looked within his own house. Our speaker is going to be Michael Peterson, Pete's son. Michael Peterson has had a successful career divided between private sector endeavors and public service. He's been involved in the creation of at least two noteworthy firms, Evolve IP and GPX Enterprises. He has worked in corporate finance, as did his father. He's engaged in a range of public service endeavors, going from the international realm, where he's involved with the management of the Peterson Institute for International Economics here in town, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, all the way down to the local level, the Partnership for New York City, and the Northside Center for Child Development. So I don't know, Michael, why your dad didn't recognize you, but he should have given you a lot more credit. We're very grateful to have you here to speak to us today, and also for all the work you've done on behalf of CED.
Thank you very much, Joe. Well, the one resume item you didn't have on there, Joe, was that I was an intern at CED in 1989. So for any of you interns out there, one day you too will be able to speak at the policy conference. But I'm very proud to be here. As was noted, my dad was, I think, the longest serving trustee of the organization. So our family has been a friend of the organization for many years, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what our foundation does and what we're working towards, and describe for you the fiscal challenge as we see it and what lies ahead for us. So, as many of you know, the Peterson Foundation is a nonpartisan organization, and our mission, quite simply, is to increase awareness and accelerate action on America's long-term fiscal challenges, because we believe that debt is absolutely a critical issue for our economy, for our future role in the world, and for our way of life. And so today I'll focus on the major structural challenges that lie in front of us, but also some of the recent legislation, which frankly has only made things far worse. And following the midterm results, we're in a new landscape in Washington today, and we think divided government represents both a requirement and an opportunity to address some of these important challenges. And the good news is there's a lot of things we can do about this, and we know exactly what they are, and all of this, unlike many other challenges around the world, this is within our control. So there's lots of important things that I'll talk about that we can do to address these issues. So let me start with a look at our long-term debt. So if you're looking over the long term, the best way to look at debt is as a share of GDP. And this yellow line here, 60%, that is considered by many economists to be a reasonable maximum. So actually, when the European Union was first founded, you had to be below that level to become a member. So that's kind of a reasonable ceiling. And here's where we are today. So significantly as a result of the financial crisis and years of fiscal irresponsibility, we're at 78%. That's the highest level in almost 70 years, and only since the end of World War II were we greater than that. But more dangerously, this is the long-term path we're on today. We'll reach 100% of the economy in just 10 years. We'll reach 150% in about 30 years, and that would be the highest in U.S. history by far. And believe it or not, this is a sort of optimistic case. If we continued on our current policies, we'd be at 200% over this time period. So by any measure, by any economist's point of view, this is an unsustainable and dangerous path. And what I want to try to get across today is that this is not a short-term annual budget decision-making issue. It's really a structural problem. And based on our current policies, debt and deficits will increase permanently going forward with no end in sight. And so here's kind of how that looks over the same period with regard to spending and revenues. So based on the current promises we've made, particularly in our retirement systems, combined with the tax code, we simply have no ability to pay for what we're promising. And so our problem is a fundamental structural mismatch between spending and revenues. And actually, as you noted, I've been in the private sector most of my career, and yesterday we had a mistake on the chart. Revenues was on top, and I didn't notice because I'm so used to seeing actually more revenue than spending. And then someone said, "Isn't this backwards?" And I said, "Holy cow, you're right." And it's that upside down. So it's hard to believe, but this is how it looks. And forever, we're under our current policies, we don't have enough resources to pay for what we're promising. So what's causing this? Really, there's three simple drivers. The baby boom generation retiring, increasing longevity, so we're living much longer, which is great, but it does present issues for the retirement system. And thirdly, our highly inefficient healthcare system. So let me touch on each of those. This is the aging of America. So the first main driver is the 74 million baby boomers that are just beginning to retire, and that's a huge influx into the retirement system. So today, 10,000 baby boomers will have their 65th birthday, and that will occur every single day for the next 12 years. So it's a big influx, and over the next 30 years, the number of people aged 65 and older will increase by 70%. So everyone's worried about whether there was a blue wave or a red wave instead of focusing on the gray wave that we know is coming. And secondly, as I mentioned, it's not just a large number of people, but we're all living much longer. And so we're spending more years in retirement, A, and B, the healthcare costs of the very old are much higher than the barely old. So as we grow the number of people, the increasing longevity, this is a bit of a perfect storm towards more and more healthcare retirement costs. Which brings us to the third key driver, our healthcare system in this country. So this is how the rest of the world does it. All these countries spend between 9 and 12% of GDP. The average of all OECD countries is 8.9%, and here's the leader, the United States. This is 17.2% as of, I think, a couple of years ago. We're now above 18%. So America has the most expensive and inefficient healthcare system in the developed world. We spend a staggering $3.3 trillion a year on healthcare. That's $10,000 for every person in the country every year. And worse yet, our health outcomes are no better than these other countries, and in many cases are far worse. So while healthcare costs have grown less rapidly in recent years, they are projected to keep growing and growing faster than inflation, faster than wages, and faster than the overall economy. So our highly inefficient healthcare system is a huge economic issue, but it is a key driver of our fiscal challenges. So you put these demographic and healthcare factors together, and what you see is huge increases in Social Security and major health program spending. And in fact, spending on these programs accounts for 100% of the increase in federal spending, federal non-interest spending over the long term. This is the rest of the budget. Basically, this is all of our other discretionary spending. So there's a lot of attention paid to discretionary, but it's really not where the growth is and not where the problem lies. And in fact, most of the discretionary spending levels are below historical averages already. So there's not much more room to cut. The other side of the ledger, of course, is revenues. It would be one thing if our tax code was designed to fund all these promises, but it's not. It fails to generate sufficient revenue to pay for the policies that we've chosen. It's also complex and unfair. So the tax code is riddled with these things called tax breaks and other giveaways that are known as tax expenditures. So every year we have $1.5 trillion of tax expenditures, and that's actually almost as much as we collect. This is $1.9 trillion that we collect in individual and corporate income tax revenue. So we're giving away almost as much as we're taking in. And this is what those expenditures are relative to Social Security, Medicare, and defense. So there's a huge amount of these tax expenditures and giveaways that we have that pale, that makes everything else pale in comparison on the spending side to those types of expenditures. So recently our tax code has been changed to make it worse. I'll show those charts a little bit later. But we have a significant perfect storm here, basically. Aging population, baby boom generation coming through the system, greater longevity, which is wonderful, but it does mean more years in retirement. The healthcare system we're operating within is very inexpensive and inefficient, and the revenue code is not there. It's not there to support these programs. So why does this matter, okay? And how does it affect the economy? Well, it starts with an impact on the budget itself. So these are our top 7 federal budget categories, and I'm going to leave off the labels for now, but last year this little red line was the 7th largest. By 2026 it'll be the 3rd largest. By 2046 it becomes the 2nd largest, and by 2048 this becomes the single largest line item in the budget. Anybody want to guess what that line item may be? Interest costs, exactly. This is a smart audience. So interest is becoming rapidly the largest program in our federal budget. And with all the important priorities, none of us wants this to take over. If you don't like that, look at it. Here's a depiction of the actual projected growth today in our interest costs. This is $7 trillion of interest just over the next 10 years alone. And I try to think about what we could afford with that amount of money. So as we saw last year, Republicans worked very hard for a $1.5 trillion tax cut to stimulate the economy. Democrats are keen on a $1 trillion infrastructure plan. If we didn't have all this debt, we could afford both of those times 3. So it's a huge amount of money relative to what we're trying to do with our federal budget policy. Another thing that this does is something called crowding out. So discretionary spending is where all the investments are that the federal government makes in infrastructure, education, research and development, things like that. In 1970, that was the majority of the budget. 61% of the budget was on these items, and we could make decisions about where we wanted to prioritize. By 2018, it's down to 30%, so 70% of the budget is on this autopilot, growing mandatory spending and interest. And by 2028, it's going to be close to 80-20. So this growing debt burden has a huge impact on what we can do with our budget. It also affects the economy in other ways. It takes capital away from private investment. It reduces our fiscal flexibility. So if we face another fiscal or economic crisis, we're going to have far fewer tools to deal with it. It hurts our confidence and lowers our certainty, which hurts the economy. And lastly, and importantly, it risks the safety net. Without a stable budget, the safety net and those who depend on it are put into jeopardy. So that's how the structural deficit works. I want to talk a little bit about the damage done in the recent legislation. This is our 10-year outlook before all these policies. So this is the baseline that was about $10.1 trillion of deficits. Again, we're already in this cycle where every year it's just growing and growing and growing. And here's what we decided to do. So this is the level of increased deficits as a result of the tax cuts, the revenue reductions. And then here's the spending bill that followed about 45 days later in January. So here we are at now $14 trillion of deficits when we were already at a high level of 10. And within this, just to keep our eye on the interest costs, there's an additional $1 trillion of interest that was incurred as a result of these, or that will be incurred as a result of these policies. So it was a significant increase in our debt outlook. And if you want to compare us to the rest of the world, in addition to making our fiscal problems worse, these recent measures could not have come at a less relevant time. When the economy is expanding, that's the time you should actually be getting your fiscal house in order. And that's what all of these countries are doing. So this is the projected change in debt over the next 5 years for all these countries. So their debt is actually going down as a share of GDP in all of these different countries. Here's the United States. This is not where we want to be a leader. And I believe that our fiscal security is directly linked to our national security and our ability to maintain our role in the world. As debt grows, not only are we more beholden to creditors, but we have fewer resources to invest in strength at home. So in just 5 years, we'll actually spend more on interest than we do on national defense. To me, that's a very dangerous milestone to hit. On the positive side, just to end on a little bit of a better note, as I said before, this is a very solvable problem. So As I mentioned, our foundation is a nonpartisan organization. We have done something called the Solutions Initiative. And in that, we gave grants to 5 different think tanks from across the political spectrum, left, right, and center, and said, go do whatever you want to the budget, and we'll score and measure your reforms over 25 years. So this is the current policy benchmark that I showed earlier, debt to GDP growing rapidly. And here's what they all did. This is the American Action Forum, the American Enterprise Institute, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Center for American Progress, and the Economic Policy Institute. And so they all proved that there are actually many ways to solve this problem, and they're all in agreement that our current path makes no sense. And lastly, the American public also gets it. So we do surveys actually every month, something called the Fiscal Confidence Index. And in our most recent survey, we asked voters how they feel about this issue. And 77% across party lines want the next Congress to make this a priority and deal with the national debt. So it's 74% of Democrats, 82% of independents, and 75% of Republicans. So I think the American people understand this. They know it's dangerous. They know it hurts the economy, and they're demanding solutions. So in closing, just a few key takeaways. We already have a very high level of debt today, and it's growing on an unsustainable and dangerous path. The debt has a huge effect on our economy, on our wages, on our economic growth, on our ability to invest, and on our incomes. Solutions exist. As you see on the prior chart, there's many ways to solve this problem. We've got think tanks already willing and able to give us the solutions, and it's just a matter of us building the political will to solve it. And now that the midterms are behind us, this is a new environment and a new reality, and as I said, we think it's a new opportunity to deal with this problem. So I thank you for your attention. I look forward to hearing the panel. Thank you.